How you going, everybody? Good Monday morning, good Sunday evening if you're watching stateside. This is the NFL Brekkie Show. That's Laurie Horesh. I'm Phil Murphy. Laz, we saw more picks on the weekend than Jameis Winston has thrown in his career. Only just.
So rude.
257 NFL draft selections over 3 days. The Super Bowl for the offseason happened. You and I hung out back end of round one. We
Mm-hmm.
had 400 odd tragics with us for the
Yeah, we
78-minute
did.
live show. Bravo to you. Thank
Live.
you. But here we are, Laws. The dust has settled. And now we can start to look ahead in earnest to, well, the NFL season proper. We have the schedule release in what, 2 weeks and change? And then mini camps, training camps, and it all kind of builds from here.
It's a period where 31 chasing teams and one champion. Hope renews for 31 and hope retains for the other one, the Philadelphia Eagles. But we get to, whether you're someone that follows college football throughout the season or you tap in during draft season, or you turn up on draft day and start learning names and start getting confused by the best available, particularly this year. We had some interesting slides going on. But look, day one was really fun to react to live. I think some things tweaked throughout the rest of the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say that I think your Denver Broncos faded a little bit throughout the weekend.
Yeah.
I really like the first two picks, Jade Barron and then RJ Harvey.
Loved it.
I love RJ Harvey. Love that pick. A very different vibe in the running back room to have some of the plotting nature that we've seen from the Denver Broncos in recent seasons, and now Dallas Cowboys, Javonte Williams. I think there's a little bit of fading perhaps from your Denver Broncos.
That's fair.
I think some other teams really picked up steam. I actually didn't mind where those funny Dallas Cowboys went. I think that paves the way for a potential wide receiver trade that's needed. But I think we saw some consistent narratives throughout some teams that we'll touch on a little bit. Some very limited scopes from some. I think the vibes were brought by one team in particular that hails from the state of Florida. We'll touch on that a little bit. And I don't want to say that there was a class with it was a draft year with no bad classes or everyone's haul was beautiful, but I didn't leave looking across the board at any one particular draft haul and go, that makes zero sense to me whatsoever. I think maybe that was the nature of the flat talent that it felt like, and flat in a positive way. It felt like from pick 6 or 7 through to pick
Leveled
150, it felt like you were going a pretty consistent, solid pattern of talent. There wasn't these huge cliffs. Perhaps at some positions there were cliffs, but I think there's some rays of hope for everybody. I know I've had some frustrated Giants fans in my mentions. I've had some frustrated Saints fans in my mentions. Some very frustrated Bengals fans messaging. Maybe that's the team that doesn't make too much sense to me out of all of them. You get direct messages straight away after a first round pick that nets was a 4.5 career sacks. So look,
when 17 and a half sacks from just last season is requesting a trade.
Indeed. That math isn't mathing. And maybe, you and me were DMing and sending emojis to each other, which often is the way, and it's how we're structuring some of today's show because stuff moves so fast in the NFL draft that you don't always have time to map out huge, eloquent thoughts to each other in group chats or DMs while it's all going on. So we often send emojis to each other that indicate how we're feeling. And I think with perhaps a Donovan Ezeraku pick, I might have been a little hasty on some of my comments off the top. I don't think it was the most... He's not perhaps he's not the most explosive playmaker at that position, but as the week goes on, like many of the picks that see you come along, you take a beat, you have a look around, look at the landscape, look at the makeup, and look at the fit, and it all kind of sits and starts to settle quite nicely. But look, it is a draft recovery session. It has been a very big weekend. It's been a very big weekend. We're sitting here now with 32 draft classes, and we're not going to sit here and grade. That's not what we do, is it, Phil? We're not going to sit here and grade, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 pick hauls without the setting on the field. We're going to approach this just a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know. I listened to a few different just sources at ESPN. We all have our preferred and our not preferred sports media sources. Somebody who I really enjoy as a person and somebody who I really enjoy listening to is Scott Van Pelt. And he was cracking me up early last week. And I think his line is like, we're not doing draft grades on my show. He's like, what the hell is a B- for the Bills, right? And it's a great point. Like, I think famously, the Seahawks 2012 class with Bobby Wagner, Bruce Irvin, and Russell Wilson was graded an F after the draft. 32 of 32. You got 2 Hall of Famers and one of the more proud members of that franchise in that group. So I was like, well, how do we recap this, Laws? Because I agree. Like, I don't know what the difference is between an A- and a B+ at this stage. But we do need to evaluate these classes because, like you said, my Broncos are a perfect example. I wish they would have gotten another pass catcher that's not a lottery ticket who's played 1 year of organized football in the 7th round. So how do we categorize this? And you and I, maybe this is a little too esoteric, or maybe it's just perfect for, again, our degenerate friends who tune into the show every week. Hi, everyone. You and I are big fans of Arrested Development. And one of the funniest bits in that show for me is the alternate school grades that maybe the character would receive. Famously, she got a crocodile in spelling. That's apparently a crocodile's not good. They don't give A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. They give just emotional grades, if not emotional grades. So you and I have put together some emoji grades for this class. How do we react to it? How do we evaluate it? Strengths and weaknesses combined, but what story does it tell?
Exactly. What are these teams trying to tell us about how they see themselves, how they saw this class, and what they're trying to paint going forward? So let's start with the first one that you threw out there, Phil.
Yeah.
A tasty little treat.
Yes.
One that we spend much time telling our respective children that they can't have at 8:45 in the morning after swimming lessons.
Or yeah, really round the clock. Us, it's more of a nighttime thing. Laws, for me, I give the Bucks draft an ice cream.
Tell me why.
That's the grade I give the Bucks draft. This team came in with needs at every level of defense. Edge rusher, yes, they added Hassan Reddick in the offseason, but they're going to run this 3-4 with Todd Bowles. They had needs at off-ball linebacker alongside Levante David, who's coming back, but he's 35. They have needs at cornerback. They had 7 picks all of last year. And for a coach, Todd Bowles, who's known as a defensive coach, in fact, he's the defensive coordinator for the team, that's just not enough. Baker Mayfield was the only quarterback in the NFL last season to rank top 3 in passing touchdowns, passing yards, and completion percentage. And this team won a weak division, but was outclassed in the wild card round at home by the Commanders. So here we are. Clear defensive needs. They're sitting there at 19. Jahdae Barron has fallen into their lap. And as a Broncos fan who was kind of hoping Barron would find his way there, I'm hoping maybe the Steelers pick up the phone or maybe the Rams pick up the phone, jump over all of those teams, take a QB at 19. The Bucks accrue some picks. In fact, Laws, the Bucks were one of 6 teams to not make any trades on draft weekend. The Bengals, the Packers, the Bucks, the Saints, the Commanders, the 49ers, and I'm forgetting one. But those 6 teams did not make a trade. The Bucks didn't pick up the phone at all. They're sitting there at 19, glaring defensive needs, and they went dessert first. That's why they get a nice trade. They went with Emeka Egbuka, a wide receiver who just apparently aced the pre-draft process. Interviews, combine, all that. Teams fell in love with him. And there are those players, they do that. They come in, it's like, hey, this young man's a professional. Maybe the tape says a round 2 grade, but now seeing the person and getting to know the person behind him, this guy's going to be in the NFL a long time. So that's where the Bucks went. And with Mike Evans every year putting up his 1,000 yards, but not getting any younger, Chris Godwin, who they re-signed, coming off a scary dislocated ankle injury, great. You add a wide receiver 3. You went with Jalen McMillan last year. They've got like 12 receivers on their roster, but they went dessert first. They did get the meat and potatoes later on in the draft. I wouldn't even say meat and potatoes because they got edge rusher David Walker, who dominated at Central Arkansas, led his team in tackles for loss and sacks, not once, not twice, LeBron, not 3 times, but 4 times. And Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame seems like a very solid pick with their second pick. But Laz, they run a 3-4. They need 2 off-ball linebackers. Levante David's 35. Their linebacker 2 is Anthony Weaver Jr., who they signed, on a essentially veteran's minimum contract from Miami this offseason. They are very thin behind Vita Vea, who's had some injury concerns recent year, in the spine of that defense. I think in going dessert first, this team that didn't address linebacker at all in the draft is going to find itself in the same position they were last year, cobbling together 10 wins in a weak division. Remember, they got torched twice by Kirk Cousins. Who's to say that same thing doesn't happen again? And here they are at home facing the best wild card team, whether it's whoever comes in second in the NFC East between the Commanders or the Eagles, or whoever comes in second in the NFC North between the Packers, Lions, and Vikings. and just get housed again at home in the playoffs. So that's what happens, Laws, when you go dessert first. As good as that dessert is in a deep receiver class, I felt like they should have gone Jahdae Barron first and then either gone linebacker in round 2, more in that position that's slotted, added receiver depth later instead of getting the ice cream when they stepped up to the buffet.
All right, I'm going to go when it comes to dessert first. It's not a class that I'm against by any means. Want to make that really, really clear. But the Chicago Bears clearly went friends for Caleb first. They, like right off the top, Colston Loveland.
EQBDB gets dessert first at the buffet.
It does. It does. Colston Loveland, 10th overall. I was more happy with that than you. You were more of a Tyler Warren guy. I'm more of a Colston Loveland guy. That is fine. I think Loveland's blocking is underrated. I think there's definitely skill set to be worked with there. There's a willingness. Luther Burden in the second. I'm a hoper in Luther Burden's talent, and that whatever concerns about how fierce his application is down in, down out, I hope that fades away, because you've heard he's a good guy, good kid. You get the tagged with these "are you an alpha" kind of things in the anonymous run up to the draft, but I like the talent there. I think his game-breaking ability, and you could hear that from Ben Johnson at his press conference. The first word that came out of his mouth was, he's a stud, he's a big play, and he's a game breaker waiting to happen. The fact that they didn't spend a top 50 pick on an offensive lineman, they do go get Ozzy Trapilo in the 3rd round, 6'8", I believe. So you're getting some towering potential there to play on the edge of the offensive line. They invest in the interior of the offensive line really clearly with trades, free agency, all that kind of stuff. But questions over Braxton Jones are fair at left tackle. Whether they could have looked, particularly with the way this tackle class went, that there was a really steep drop off after the kind of first, maybe I'd say the first 31 picks, shall we say, where Josh Simmons, 32 picks, sorry, where Josh Simmons came off the board to the Kansas City Chiefs.
I know you weren't high on Ariante Ursary.
Ursary scares me a little bit. Maybe I've got a little bit of Tyler Guyton syndrome there, because you read through some of the points in his scouting report and I start to go, hold on. I know I've got 2 collars to work with today, but it kind of makes me pull at both of those. But yeah, whether Braxton Jones, you do have, I'm a believer in Darnell Wright in the long term. I think hasn't perhaps been as consistent as you like, but whether they could have looked to tackle a little bit earlier. But yeah, going tight end, wide receiver off the bat, I don't think this defense performed up to expectation. They did add Grady Jarrett. I think they could have used another. I think they go Shamar Turner at the back end of the 2nd round with one of their many 2nd round picks, but not getting an edge rush, I think, to add. I know they signed. They did sign Oda Yingbo in the they acquired him in the offseason.
But it was still a need.
It was, Austin Booker is there, an interesting profile, but I think they possibly could have looked towards edge a little earlier in that one. They do have the 3-piece at cornerback with Jalen Johnson, Kyler Gordon, and Tyreek Stevenson, who more infamous than famous at this point, sadly for Tyreek Stevenson. And they've got names throughout that secondary, but whether they could have been just a little more starch a little earlier at some spots on the defense, and whether they could have attacked offensive tackle perhaps inside the top 50 picks, just got me. It's not a class I'm upset about. I'm excited to see better protection for the Chicago Bears, better offensive scheme, better offensive imagination, better execution, more cohesive unit. I still think that's on the table. But if we're looking at who took a little bit of a double scoop, maybe a triple scoop of gelato before having any vegetables, starchy carbs, healthy proteins, or healthy fats at dinner, the Chicago Bears get the nod for me.
Yeah, and Laz, the only thing I'll say about the Bears is just you're kind of at the mercy of the team with whom you trade and the picks they have and the desired moves you want to make. They traded down 15 spots in the 2nd round and essentially traded up 10 from round 3 to round 2. It seemed like they got kind of the short end of that deal. But it's a team that, again, given what was out there, perhaps maybe gone a different way. But I think the dessert first assessment is fair enough. But they were decently active in free agency, and it's not a class that you look down on at all. And like you said, there aren't many in that group. All right, next grade we're giving. I am giving the Bills circle the wagons, but I'm not giving them a wagon. I'm giving them a train. Because, Laz, this team had a one-track mind. Sean McDermott rocked up to the draft, him and Brandon Beane in Orchard Park sitting in their offices, and they said, we want defenders, and we need dudes from the SEC, apparently. This is the team that we know was an inch away from misguided Josh Allen tush push, perhaps, from finally getting over the Chiefs hoodoo. They have not. Now 0-4 in the playoffs head to head. And would it surprise anybody if they get a fifth bite at the apple in January of this year? Wouldn't surprise me if I'm freezing my butt off on one of those sidelines in January. But Laz, this is a team last year as Josh Allen won MVP. And a lot of the case for Allen was he did as much or more with less. And then here they go. They kind of like a net subtraction from their receiving core. They add Josh Palmer. They lose Mac Hollins and Amari Cooper, who remains a free agent. I guess he could return to Buffalo. But Bills, other needs be damned. We are going defensive players from the SEC. End of round one, they took the green room hype man, who was Max Hairston. Electric at the combine, 4.29 40. I think he was the fastest player overall, let alone the fastest corner. They get him. They get TJ Sanders from South Carolina, the interior defensive lineman. Landon Jackson, another one of these guys who really aced the pre-draft process, saw his stock rise. And he had one of those cool, very emotional phone calls from Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott when he got in there. And then who am I forgetting? They got the Deion Walker from Kentucky, Max Hairston's teammate. So their first 4 picks off the board were defensive players from the SEC. And it's not like, now it's like, we call the Oregon the Big Ten because they're in the Big Ten for a year. No, these are old school SEC teams with a reputation. That's what the Bills stuck their stake in the ground on. Now, in a deep wide receiver class, I thought at some point they could have taken a wide receiver, somebody, because right now their receiving room, if last year it was a 6, this year is like a 4.5, 5. They do have Khalil Shakir, who's turned into a wide receiver 1, but it starts to get pretty thin, and you're still, I think, overly reliant on Josh Allen. I think in a class with a lot of round 2, round 3, round 4 projected NFL talent, could have taken somebody and deviated from the track. But Laz, circling the wagons, we had both wheels. Do trains have wheels? On studs on the tracks, a single track mine. You get where I'm going.
Yeah, I think that round 4, there was a little dip there. Jalen Royals staring at someone to come up and get him at some point.
And at the Broncos until the Chiefs took him at 143 or whatever they took him.
Yeah, and the Bills wouldn't be, we're talking about Bills needing some wide receiver help. The team that they're trying to overcome over and over and over and over and over again in the AFC, go and get a guy that I think could have belonged on that wide receiver core in Buffalo for sure. I love that pick from the Chiefs. The Chiefs in general was a draft class that I really enjoyed. I'm not sure where they fit in our emotional encyclopedia over the week, but in terms of just classes,
we don't have them on the list.
But what I do have, when we're talking about one-track minds, right? The train did not leave the track for the Detroit Lions and the Dan Campbell mantra. Here's a couple of words that you'll see used in scouting profiles for some of the players that they took. And you tell me if this sounds a little bit familiar when it comes to the Detroit Lions. Okay, Mauler, dirtbag in a positive way in regards to, I believe that was Tate Ratledge from the offensive guard out of Georgia. Heat-seeking missile, Dan Jackson, who was one of their later picks, and a self-titled self-titled powerhouses from several of their players as well. So there we go. We've got Maulers, dirtbags, heat-seeking missiles, and powerhouses. That sound pretty familiar when it comes to the Detroit Lions, Dan Campbell's mantra. Look, it's a good class. I think there's decent value throughout. Really like Tyler Williams, mentioned Ratledge, guys like Miles Fraser coming off the board there. That was another offensive lineman there as they started to build getting multiple interior offensive line. We know they've had some movement there. And look, Dan Jackson, safety from Georgia, getting multiple Bulldogs, a triple Bulldog across their draft class there. But Jackson was the heat-seeking safety that they plucked up late on day 3. But look, there's a very common football mantra. There's a very common football philosophy, energy that comes out of Detroit Lions. I don't think they bucked that at all. I think that was very clear in the football players they approach. And that's one of these things that we do see teams tell us. Sometimes they're going for out and out, down and dirty power. You see some teams have years where literally everyone they draft was a captain because maybe they recognize in their locker room that the culture's got away. We talk about culture. It's this, flimsy, indefinable, is the word ineffable? Ineffable term. And how do you put your finger on the pulse of what that actually means when you're constructing a team? But at the top in front offices, they'd know when the vibe's off in locker rooms. And sometimes we see teams that go, you know what we need? We need high football character. We need captains. And then we'll literally go rounds 1 through 7, and everyone that they pluck, yeah, they'll be high enough near their board at the time. Maybe they're the top player on their board, but they normally have a football, a little captaincy, a C there on the jersey because they recognize that's what they need. But for me, yes, Detroit Lions, the kneecap biting, the cartilage eating, the ACL flossing, whatever we're up to at this point. That was very, very much on show with what Dan Campbell and his front office there put together and assembled for a team that's going to make another run deep into the NFC picture.
Well, it's grit. I mean, it's kind of intangible. Dan Campbell was a punchline at that first press conference and a punchline through a slow start in Detroit. But what a pivot of that team. And the question is, how much will the brain drain affect him with Ben Johnson, offensive coordinator, having departed to Chicago? Aaron Glenn, defensive coordinator, gets promoted. He's the head coach at the Jets. Last season, they were the only team in the entire NFL with Detroit with head coach OC DC, that triumvirate, entering even a third season together. The only one. And obviously they had the top seed in the NFC. This coming season, there are 5. So teams that are keeping head coach OCDC together. We'll see if that model translates and how much is lost for the Lions. And it wasn't just OCDC. I mean, their passing game coordinator left. He's an offensive coordinator now elsewhere. So a lot of change to happen. But if you can keep that buzzword culture together, and I just go, if you haven't seen it, the Ahmed Hassanin, I always say his name wrong, the kid from Boise State. Incredible story, by the way. Born in LA, very young age, moved to Egypt with his dad. Was in love with American football. His brother back in LA called his dad, talked him into letting Hassanin fly to LA, pursue an American football dream. He goes to Boise State, raises hell in offensive backfields. He was the most impactful player for Boise State in their college football playoff loss to Penn State. The phone call of Hassanin getting his dream come true. And then, yes, coach. Coach, I will die for you. I will run through a wall for you, through tears. I was like, that's a Dan Campbell player. That's the type of guy you get. And so you're talking at the top, man. All the way down, it was one track for the Lions.
Yep. Absolutely. So, all right, Phil.
Our next
going
grade,
into a keyboard. What's next?
Our next grade. The Falcons are getting a giraffe.
Interesting.
They're getting a giraffe for this draft.
Did they draft Mike Glennon?
Originally, you know what, Laz? Originally, when I thought of this giraffe thing, I was going to pile on some team that had a terrible draft and say, like, yeah, they thought this was an NFL giraffe. They didn't really understand the assignment. That was my joke. And then there isn't really a team that stuffed it up that badly.
No, there isn't. But I can't believe I had to put up with that at, like, not even lunchtime on a Monday morning. I mean, my brain is pickled.
And this is on the back end of some technological headaches for you.
Yeah, my brain is pickled up.
You see Laz's hair thinning throughout. It's not male pattern baldness. It's the catch-22 of some of our security protocols at his laptop. Anywho,
thank you.
So the Falcons are getting a giraffe for this draft because they stuck their neck out a lot. Last year, the Falcons were second from bottom in most passing touchdowns allowed. Bad. They were second from bottom in sacks, which has been an issue for this team, I don't know, for 6 years. You go back to 2019, they have 30 sacks fewer than any other team. And you can basically partition that every year since. They've just been terrible at getting after the quarterback in a league where that's more important than ever with how offenses are constructed. And they had gone since Tack McKinney, 2017, without drafting a front 7 player. So what do the Falcons do? Well, they take Jalen Walker, an off-ball linebacker you can line up on the edge, and they're going to run a 3-4, so they'll probably use him predominantly as an edge rusher more than an off-ball linebacker. Great. Take him midway through the first round. It's what we thought they should have done with their pick last year. They didn't. They went with Michael Penix at 8. He's apparently the quarterback of the future. Good on you. So Falcons have done their job. Great. Then Sean McVay, Les Snead, bleep them picks. They get a phone call, presumably, from Terry Fontenot in Atlanta saying, we want to trade back into the first round. Atlanta, you had some of the lowest, I think 5th lowest draft capital coming in. They only entered with 5 picks in this draft. They're giving up a first next year to trade back in, stick their neck out, and double down on edge rusher, James Pierce. Again, fine. They did bring in Leonard Floyd this offseason. They have Arnold Ebiketie. I don't know if on day one either Walker or Pierce are going to start, but everybody had mid to late first round grades on these. Some guys had a high first round grade on James Pierce with some other factors perhaps making him slip down. But these are guys who could turn into very viable pass rushers. But you give up a first next year for a team that's had 7 straight losing seasons. So would it surprise you if that were 8 straight? That could be a top 15 pick that the Rams just picked up for next season. And then the Falcons, already mentioned, they gave up the second most passing touchdowns last year, 39 of them. They didn't take a corner anywhere. They took 2 safeties, Xavier Watts and Bobby Bowman Jr., who do a lot of the same. Well, Watts, Xavier Watts from Notre Dame. He's, ball hawking center fielder, and then Bobby Bowman's going to kind of crash down. But you have Jesse Bates, who's not under contract after this season, but taking back-to-back safeties when you have a much more glaring need at corner and you already have limited draft capital. This wasn't a team like the 49ers that had 11 picks and didn't trade a single one of them, by the way. Or the Browns, who entered with 10 picks and chiseled that down to 7 to double down on quarterback and running back. No, this is a team that went edge rusher, safety, and then flyer at the end were fine. Big time need at cornerback remains, and now you're in a division with the Bucs, who are just loading up on wide receivers. It gives me a lot of concern, and the Panthers, who showed impressive year-over-year progression and added to their own receiving room in the draft, and they just picked up Hunter Renfrow today. I struggle to pick the Falcons to finish top 2 in this division, even with their neck stuck out.
Yeah, I think
in this NFL giraffe.
1, shout out to Arnold Ebiketie, former draft crush of mine. 2, the Falcons and their edge rushers have just been a constant narrative. We talked about it during round 1. It's like the Giants' offensive line. Like, it's just one of these things that's just been absolutely hapless for so long. Actually, probably longer.
We need a bad reputation show. Like,
probably.
We should do a bad reputation.
So we have seen these things fester for so long. This was such an obvious and pointed way to address it. I think Walker is absolutely deserving of an early first-round grade. I love that pick at 15. I did not see the double trade up coming there, but a cornerback, obviously another area of need. This was it was not one-track minded. Perhaps it was a touch limited in its scope that they did cover with this draft class. But while you mentioned at the top, we were talking about a few things at top of this little emoji, and you said F them picks. I mean, that brings me to my nomination for the giraffe, and that is the Jacksonville Jaguars, who, F them picks. The ties to the LA Rams front office on show there as their 34-year-old general manager makes a splash. Massively contrasting. Everybody had the same thought at the same time. Browns, Jaguars, huge draft day trade, straight out of the movie Draft Day. No Kevin Costner this time, but the Jags
Sonny Weaver back, on the phone. Bo Callahan.
No Sonny. The Jags wrestling back respect and their reputation as the aggressors. Moving up to number 2, that's putting your neck out, going out and getting wide receiver corner in Travis Hunter off the board there to form a fascinating dual act there with Brian Thomas Jr. But it goes beyond that. I think this is the team. They put their neck out. They brought the vibes throughout this draft in total. You go and get yourself a guard named Wyatt from West Virginia. That's a certain motif we're going for there. Yep. They get a guy in Bashal Tootin, who had a lot of fans throughout the league, a lot of straight line speed there. I'm hoping, because I've seen these kind of day 3-ish running backs with the ridiculous straight line speed come and go before. I remember the hype train around Israel Abanaconda. I was not one of those. I felt right in that judgment. I think Tootin's got more to his game. He has a lot of fans. LaQuint Allen's one of the most fascinating watchers of any prospects in this whole draft class, because he's this like bendy, like Gumby-legged running back that looks too tall and has these really interesting smooth cuts, but it actually, honestly, it did remind me a little of watching Austin Booker rush off the edge last year, where he looked like Kevin Durant rushing off the edge. Wasn't quite as extreme for LaQuint Allen, but an interesting running back one, because there's a lot of people coming out from day one were saying, hey, big winner from this was Travis Etienne. They didn't take Genty, so he was safe there. But I think there are a couple interesting day 2 backs that they're going to push that. Not to mention Tank Bigsby in the room as well. But Look, for me, yeah, I can't go past it. If we're putting our neck out here, it is the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's their front office. It's the entire operation going, the last couple years of disappointment we're putting behind us. And we're going to, and the best way to put behind this is to create a new storyline and a new headline. And there's no bigger headline than trading future first round picks, which could be, maybe they do right the ship and get back into the playoff picture, and this first round pick next year is in the 20s, but it's not going to be out of the realm of possibility that we're talking about the Jacksonville Jaguars and their first round pick having landed somewhere nestled in the top 10 this time next year either. So look, that's putting your neck out. It's fascinating. They've instantly become one of the most interesting teams to watch as we go into the offseason and into training camp. The training camp clips of Travis Hunter, Trevor Lawrence, and BTJ, Brian Thomas Jr. are going to be one to watch. But yeah, throughout that one, just a really interesting draft class. Even Caleb Ransall, a cornerback on those day 2 cornerbacks, perhaps he went a little earlier out of Tulane. Perhaps he went a little earlier than some of the names that we saw hanging around a little later in the draft as well, in a pretty interesting cornerback class. So putting the neck out, Jacksonville Jaguars, what do we got next?
Yeah, it's fun, Laws, but my concern with the Jags, they lost an NFL high 5 games last season in which they led or were tied in the final 2 minutes. If these games were 58 minutes, not 60, this team's 9-7. They're 4-13, and they did not address one of their glaring needs. Cornerback, wide receiver, 2 for 1 with Travis Hunter. To what degree, how many plays he can stay on the field. Liam Cohen said he's going to organize the meeting schedules to make it work for wide receivers and corners, so Hunter can fulfill that obligation. If his body can hold up, awesome. But this interior defensive line for a team that ranked second from bottom in yards per play allowed overall is a concern, and it's going to be a concern. But anything you can do to get more out of Trevor Lawrence, who last year, I think amongst qualified QBs, second worst completion percentage to Anthony Richardson, who's historically bad, need to get a little more. Bashal Tutin helps with that out of the backfield, and presumably the elite, the rare, the truly generational ball skills of Travis Hunter as a receiver qualify for that. I'll go, Laws, with my next grade, the team involved in that round 1 trade with the Jags. The Browns, their grade, the Browns get a unicorn. That's their draft grade. Reason, Laws, they get a unicorn is because they treated this like a fantasy draft. And I don't mean at the top, going Mason Graham, and people might say, what? They had so many needs. They didn't really need interior defensive line. If you can get a guy who was 1 or 1A on 97% of draft boards for D tackles, you can never, the Eagles taught us you can never have enough O-line, D-line depth. And so for me, I have no problem really ever if you take one of the top D linemen in the class. Now, typically I would say if you're a team with the luxury of doing so, but if the Browns want to build that with their identity, having now just married themselves to Myles Garrett for so long and take a little pressure off him on the outside, fine. This team has had and has a glaring need at wide receiver. Laws, their wide receiver 3, I don't mean to disparage the poor guy, but Michael Woods II is their number 3 wide receiver. In an era of 11 personnel where you have 3 receivers on the field, Michael Woods was drafted in 2022. So he's played 3 full seasons in the NFL. He has 12 more career catches than me and a ruptured Achilles on his CV. So there's concern about wide receiver depth. If you want to run 22 personnel every snap, that's an option. But the reason I grade the Browns like this is a fantasy draft, because when you and I are drafting fantasy lineups in August, we're going to take a couple running backs and a couple quarterbacks because that's what you do in fantasy drafts. You don't do that in real drafts when you already have Deshaun Watson, who's injured for the season, but he's got $167 million in dead cap tied to him currently at the moment, which drops all the way to 130 next year. So cutting him without cause is not an option. They signed Joe Flacco in the offseason, 1 year, $40 million. He's probably got the inside track on starting week 1. You traded for Kenny Pickett, a pick in this draft to do so. And then you draft Dylan Gabriel in the 4th, then Shedeur Sanders in the 5th. And between Sanders and one of the 2 running backs he drafted, Dylan Sampson, who we both like, you gave up in total 6 picks in the 5th, 6th, and 7th round for those 2 moves to jump up to those picks. So any kind of like high ceiling kind of flyer roster player who you liked, one of your sleepers who, if he hits, presents tremendous value, you gave away all of those lottery tickets to now draft 2 quarterbacks, one of whom certainly is going to get cut before camp. And if he's not, that means Kenny Pickett's going to get cut, who you traded a pick in this draft to get. So something is not adding up with treating this like a fantasy draft. And there's a lot of reading into Andrew Berry's body language during the Shedeur Sanders pick. Some saying that looked like an owner suggestion that the GM was not on board with. From Jimmy Haslam, who himself has been very outspoken. Hey, we swung and missed at Deshaun Watson, a guy who's still currently on the roster and who you are very much still tied to for at least the next 2 off seasons. You give up every pick at the expense of 144 overall, with needs at edge rushing depth, needs at safety, and a massive need at wide receiver, who's only going to help this underwhelming or very old Joe Flacco's 40 stable of QBs. I think a little bit more reality would have done you well, Cleveland. And again, I might be in the minority here. Kuiper gave this draft an A+. So Mel's been doing this 41 more years than I have. But I don't see A+ when you know one of the picks that you ascribe, hey, one of these guys is going to be great value, and the other one's going to be a freebie for some team to pick up off a waiver wire.
A couple thoughts. One, that shot of the Browns front office, head coach Kevin Stefanski, GM Andrew Berry, everyone just on shot there when the Shedeur Sanders pick. That had all the energy of a row of parents at the kindergarten Christmas Carol concert where the announcement comes from the teacher that, don't worry, we only have 6 more songs to go at 8 p.m. on a Friday.
Yeah, you think it's over and it's a 5-minute intermission?
And every parent sitting there going, 1, this is some grim singing as cute as they are, and 2, it's already 8 p.m. These kids singing more, and then I've got to get them home in the car. This is going to be ratchet as anything. So that's the vibe we got off there. 2, yeah, we're talking about they treated this like fantasy. You know who the Browns are coming out after this draft? They're that guy that leaves your fantasy draft with like 3 quarterbacks, in this case 2, but 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, no wide receivers, no tight ends. Like, it's cool, bro. We can trade him. I've got assets to trade, bro. Just got assets to trade.
Didn't draft a defense or a kicker, and he's just going to figure it out. Like, okay.
Now, hold on. Sometimes I don't draft a defense or a kicker because I need extra flex.
But if you don't do both, then you know you're getting rid of 2 of the guys you just drafted.
Exactly. Yeah. That's you only do both, and that's fine because I'm just going to drop like one of the receivers I took late, like Randall Cobb.
More egregious because you and I can debate if it's okay to do that. Now, skip a defense and kicker in a fantasy draft. But in a reality draft, the Browns only have 2 viable receivers to line up if they both stay healthy.
Phil,
Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman.
I think Shedeur is going to end up playing the most starts, getting the most starts at QB for the Browns this season.
He might. And
I don't think
it was the topic of draft weekend. Him being
I don't think
overall did not have anything to do with his aptitude as a player. By all reports, it came into him completely bombing the interview process.
And we don't see those interviews, but clearly something didn't go right. In that process.
And
the interviews,
it's every outlet. McShay, Pelissero with details and names.
He's not the first player to not have an agent, but that clearly didn't help the process either. Like, this draft process was not handled well. It is in many ways, the draft process can be a bit of a campaign, particularly at the quarterback position. Mm-hmm. We're almost running a campaign. That goes from how you handle yourself in interviews, the agent's work, the PR running around the team, how you handle yourself at all public opportunities, training opportunities, team opportunities, all that kind of thing.
Going to an all-star game and not.
But when we put it on tape, like, if we're just looking at how they play the game, how the quarterback position, Joe Flacco, it's been a fun ride, but I don't think you're looking for him to start more than a couple of games.
Yeah.
I'm not looking.
He's weeks 1 to 5.
My faith in Kenny Pickett is not high.
No. And listen, if he was here with the Eagles talent around him, where's he at in Cleveland, Les?
Exactly.
Tell me when.
Now I don't believe Deshaun Watson plays another snap for the Cleveland Browns ever again. So now we're down to Dylan Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders, and off tape, if they're going toe to toe, Shedeur doesn't have a howitzer on his right arm, but he's got plenty of arm. Mm-hmm. Can't be said for Dylan Gabriel. Shedeur Sanders isn't an overwhelming athlete. Dylan Gabriel is fitting more into that Kellen Moore mold perhaps as a physical
If I'm
specimen
Dylan Gabriel,
quarterback.
I'm pissed. I'm like, hey, could you have just let me get drafted by a team that was actually going to play me?
Yeah, yeah,
At
absolutely.
so you just gave up your 94th overall pick to kind of prove a point?
Yeah. I wondered if, I was wondering at the end of day 2, like, okay, let's take off all the teams that we've talked about. In the end, it was one of the teams that we talked about that took Shador. But what would be a landing spot that kind of makes sense? And it's a landing spot. The one that came to mind for me, the Rams, obviously because of the age of Matthew Stafford and stuff, but one came to mind to me was one of the landing spots Dylan Gabriel had been talked about a lot. And that was the Miami Dolphins, because I thought, look, it's not like they have their offense is run with an overwhelming athlete with a huge power arm. We're talking about accuracy, getting the ball out quickly, which Shador can do. He can hold on in certain situations, but when tasked to play quick game and tasked to get the ball out and distribute, get it out wide and screens and things, he does that. He did that a plenty at Colorado, and so
He's good
accuracy
pre-snap.
and accuracy and quick timing and good and decent pre-snap work.
Yeah.
And being able to layer the ball and throw with touch. Those are things that he absolutely all could have done. So I wondered about, but look, I think he can beat out Dylan Gabriel in terms of the battle of the rookies in camp. And after that, I just don't see an overwhelming amount in front of him for a franchise that needs some level of excitement. Okay, that was an extended chat on the Cleveland Browns. No surprise there. We may touch on them quickly coming up, but I promise that was just be a quick reference from mine. But in terms of unicorns and who treated it like fantasy, for me, again, not a draft class this is a team that I've been confused by their drafts many times. Cleveland Farrell. But the Las Vegas Raiders did some interesting things, but to deny that this doesn't have a certain air of fantasy about it with what they put together over their draft, starting with Ashton Genty, the most fantasy relevant player in this fantasy football relevant player in the entire NFL draft. Jack Betch coming off the board there, a phenomenal story himself out of TCU, inside outside versatility at wide receiver, great hands, can work the tempo of his routes really, really nicely. This guy has the ability to track it downfield, but an interesting wide receiver to add there. You go back-to-back offensive line picks at the tail end of the 3rd round, so you're building up the offense there. Caleb Rogers and then Charles Grant. And then you come back with, as you mentioned before the show, there's been NFL players referred to as the 9 God. Some seriously, some perhaps tongue-in-cheek. Tony Romo would be one. But the 9 route God, that is Deontay Thornton, who's giving you straight line speed down the sideline. So you go from Jack Betch, who's a bit more of a complete receiver, perhaps a little more nuance to his game, and then you bring out Thornton. What is it with wide receivers named Thornton, by the way, that are 9 route specialists?
Thornton,
yeah. Hopefully this one ages a little bit. I certainly like the price for Dante Thornton, the draft day cost, I should say, for Dante Thornton in the 4th round, a lot better than Tyquan Thornton, who should have gone on day 3. That was the old Patriots regime. So definitely some fantasy vibes here from the Las Vegas Raiders that went and got themselves offensive line protection in the middle of it, but 2 wide receivers and the most preeminent fantasy entity in this draft, Ashton Genty, first of his name.
And Laz, it's a Raiders team that, spanning their time in Vegas, Oakland, LA. This is the first time last season was the first time they ranked dead last in yards per carry. So while they haven't in recent years had prolific run games, last year was particularly bad. And they were one of 2 teams in the NFL to never score 27 points last season.
And you know what? This is a team with a history of good running backs.
Yeah.
Like
Marcus Allen,
Darren McFadden in full flight. The great what could have been Bo Jackson.
Yeah.
Like this, Josh Jacobs was there with some massive seasons. But this is a team that when you think of, it doesn't sit at the top of those lists, but we all remember where we were the Monday Night Football that Latavius Murray entered the picture. And there were a bunch of mystery things out there. It's like, is this DeMarco Murray's brother? Because he actually ran a lot like him on that debut. They also burst onto the scenes with similar debuts, kind of massive runs and stuff like that. So, this is a team, when you think of the Raiders, I think of Hall of Fame talent at that position. So I know I interrupted there, but just there is something. And this offensive line wasn't as bad as feared in 2024. And adding a couple of mid-round picks, one on the outside and one projected to push inside to guard, don't mind that as well. So, look, a positive thing. This is fantasy to me because I think it's very fantasy relevant. Perhaps, again, double dipping at wide receiver, running back, double dipping at offensive tackle. Bit fantasy there. But, yeah, I know I interrupted, but I'll hand it back to you. Yep.
No, I mean, I was kind of laying in the play in that one of two teams without 27 points last season. And Napoleon Kaufman's another Raiders running back, late 90s there. He spent like 5 years in Oakland.
Sorry, I just want to, while we're on the topic of fantasy, a different, like there's levels to this. This is how you got my brain going. But, talking fantasy, talking about play and also talking about, perhaps the fantasy writings. This is a team that drafted a guy named Tonka Hemingway on day 3. So, if we're rounding out fantasy words here, we've got the fantasy play of Tonka Trucks along with the writings of Hemingway. So, yeah, they tie it all up together there. Thank you for giving us, one little emoji you provided, Phil, but the layers, they just, it's, it wasn't an onion emoji, but it may as well have been.
I told you the topic would land, Laws. I told you.
All right, what do you got for us to close out?
All right, to close out, Pittsburgh, your draft gets a map.
A map.
And one of the old school maps, you remember in the back of your parents' sedan?
Yeah, we called the Gregs. It was Get the Gregs Out. It was the name of the yeah, I think it was the name of the brand. Hold on, you talk.
Yeah,
I'll
it could
Google.
be. You look
Why
that up.
did Australians
It makes sense.
call
It's
it
one
the
of those
Gregs?
like, hey, can I Xerox this? Do you want a Coke? Can I have a Kleenex? Well, the brand supersedes what it actually is. But the map where you got like a portion of the drive, and to continue on, sometimes you go to the next page. Sometimes you have to go to the back of the damn book and just, all right, what it continues on page 43. What? I got to find that. And your dad's yelling at you. As I sit here in my therapy session. But the Pittsburgh Steelers draft gets a map because, Laws, do they scout anywhere other than the Big Ten? The Steelers had 7 picks. The first 6 were drafted out of the Big Ten. Derek Harmon, again, new Big Ten, Oregon, terrific defensive tackle. Pittsburgh in the first round has drafted a defensive tackle 3 times before. Mean Joe Green, he's in the Hall of Fame. Gabe Rivera, who's in the College Football Hall of Fame, didn't quite pan out as a pro. And Casey Hampton, 5-time Pro Bowler, 2-time Super Bowl champion. He's in the Steelers' Ring of Honor. So they're 2 for 3 at least, going D tackle in the first round. I have no problems with that. No second-round pick for the Steelers. They gave that up for DK Metcalf. They go Caleb Johnson, Iowa in the third. Doesn't even need to change his wardrobe, going from yellow and black to yellow and black. And then the Steelers continue on. Jack Sawyer out of Ohio State. If you watched any Ohio State football, namely in the college football playoffs, saw him make some fantastic plays. You would have thought he could be a Steeler, and you'd be right. And then they go Yaya Black, also out of Iowa, also doesn't even need to reach in his closet. But then, Laws, this is where my critique is for the Steelers draft. I gave him a map. Will Howard out of Ohio State. Again, now you got another Big Ten footprint. Doesn't need to travel all that far to move house from Columbus to Pittsburgh. But the Steelers still leave this draft with their quarterback at the moment, Mason Rudolph. Mike Tomlin, as the old saying goes, making some chicken salad every year. But the critique now, and it gets louder every year, well, the Steelers haven't won a playoff game in however long, whilst not having a losing record for 19 straight seasons. Several of those 19 seasons, this was not a playoff caliber team. That Mike Tomlin, by hook or by crook or by creating some chicken salad, got this team into the playoffs, and they got overwhelmed. Laws, my concern. Even if Aaron Rodgers comes in on a 1-year rental with one good Achilles, and he certainly is hampered a little bit by that injury. Aaron Rodgers, age 41, 42. How different is this year going to be than last year? Especially in that locker room when now you got to balance George Pickens, DK Metcalf, and Aaron Rodgers. That chemical reaction cocktail that you handle with care. What's going to keep this team from going 9-8, 10-7 again, and then getting their doors blown off in Buffalo or Kansas City in the wild card round again? And now you're in the same position as last year. Or you don't, and you traded a second-round pick in this draft for DK Metcalf to have Mason Rudolph throwing in the ball in a division with Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. So that's my concern for the Steelers. Like you didn't really. I kid. They scouted outside the Big Ten, but ultimately they decided on 6 Big Ten picks to start the draft. Fine. But now it just seems like kicking the can one more year up the road. And next year's draft is intriguing because this year there were a handful of QB-starved teams going into draft weekend. And some of them took guys, all of them really except one took guys that had a non-clear first round grade. So you're in a position next year where I think the draft class is going to be perceived more as the 2024 class, in that you have Drew Aller out of Penn State, Garrett Nussmeier out of LSU, Nico Iamaleava out of UCLA, Arch Manning out of Texas, Miller Moss out of USC, Haynes King out of Georgia Tech, Cade Klubnik out of Clemson, Carson Beck out of Miami, less so. But they're going to be like 12. I could name 12 guys, Laz, and Lenore Sellers out of South Carolina has a chance to be very special. Who today, now some of them like Sellers, he may opt to stay another year in Columbia, fine. But of those guys, I think 6 are going to get drafted in the first round. And I can't tell you today with any measure of confidence really who those 6 are, but there are enough that every draft pundit will tell you this class, 2026 at quarterback, is closer to the 2024 class in quality. So kicking up the can up the road 1 year if you're the Steelers is fine, except now you're probably going to be drafting 17, 18, 19, 20 again, and not really in a position. We saw last year, QB6 went at 12. So if we think this class is at all comparable to that, teams are going to draft above the perceived value of the grade because of the incredible importance of the position. The Steelers may be the 7th one to sit down at musical chairs when there are 6 spots to sit. So this is more of a Steelers like, what's the plan question, whether or not they have Rodgers, that I don't see this team finishing anywhere other than 3rd in the division again.
Got a couple of comments. The Steelers has really riled up Benny G here. Remind me again, what have Joe and Lamar won, Phil, as much as Purdy and Mason spending big money to lose in the playoffs?
They've won more playoff games since they've joined the NFL than the Steelers have.
Yes, they have not won Super Bowls, but the Steelers
Joe Burrow's
win
been to a Super Bowl.
Look, I think with the Steelers, you're sitting there at this point judging which old quarterback with an Achilles injury in recent history you want to go for, Rodgers
Kirk
or
Cousins, or
does Kirk Cousins come into the picture there? Because I think one of the losers this weekend, and we're not doing like draft winners, draft losers. You get an F minus, as we mentioned, you get an A plus. But one of the actual
unicorn and an ice cream cone. Damn it.
One of the individual losers of this draft weekend, individually as a single player, would be Kirk Cousins because of how some of those windows shut down. Right, obviously the Cleveland Browns, I think you can't have 6 quarterbacks there at this point. The New York Giants addressing their needs. We knew what the Titans were going to do. The New Orleans Saints, not that they were the most commonly tied to someone like Kirk Cousins, but going and getting Tyler Shuck in the 4th round for a price that I prefer than what the Giants did with Jackson Dart. The Giants draft in general for me was a not a bad process. I just didn't love some of the selections. There's some nice pieces there. And then I'm not a big Cam Scatterby guy. I'm not the biggest Jackson Dart guy. I don't mind the price you paid to move up, the process, the actual method you went with, but the play selection. But look, clearly you've attracted some of the attention there. For me, my map is going to be very simple, very quick. We spent enough time on the Cleveland Browns, but they get my map because despite the fact that I think they could have used some offensive line talent, they did operate in that area of the field, but that area of the field alone, this is a line of scrimmage draft through and through. They did not draft outside of the middle of the field. The old spine, as we like to say, Phil. Mason Graham, defensive tackle. Carson Schwartz.
But they didn't get a safety out of TC. They didn't get a Big 12 safety for you, Laz.
No, they didn't. Carson Schwartz out of UCLA.
One of your past Big 12
I love
safety crushes.
Petrie. Quinshon Judkins, running back. Harold Fannin Jr., tight end. Dylan Gabriel, quarterback. Dylan Sampson, love Dylan. So doubling up on quarterbacks and Dylan's. Dylan Sampson, running back, obviously should do a Sanders. But literally everyone is either attached to the line of scrimmage in the middle there or in the immediate backfield.
Harold Fannin's more of a tight end. I mean, he caught like 117 passes last year at Bowling Green.
I know, but still, it occurred to me. It occurred to me that a team that perhaps could have used some added talent at wide receiver for a team that for a team that was largely linked to a certain skill position in the defensive backfield. Mr. Hunter there. that perhaps we would have seen a little bit of diversity there, but very straight down. If we're literally putting a map down, you could put down a little 5 meter by 5 meter square, and you could pretty much going to encapsulate everybody that they drafted in that class so far. Well, in their class,
I'll go through their free agent class for you. Offensive guard Tevin Jenkins, quarterback Kenny Pickett via trade, D tackle Malik Collins, 2 years, $20 million, Cornelius Lucas, offensive tackle, edge rusher Joe Tryon Shoyinka, Jerome Baker, off-ball middle linebacker, and Joe Flacco. Now, I left out one, DeAndre Carter. There's your receiver.
Oh,
your wide receiver 4, behind Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, Michael Woods II. There is not, if we're ranking wide receiver rooms in the NFL, they're 32nd by a margin, and they're going to spin the wheel amongst 5 players, 4 who are healthy, who's going to play quarterback, and that guy's not getting a lot of help in terms of separation.
Okay. That wraps out our emojis. There's one emoji that I will touch on here quickly, and that's the Australian flag emoji, just with a bit of an Aussie update from the draft. We did see your Denver Broncos with the only punter taken, Jeremy Crawshaw.
Yeah, hope he never sees the field except to hold for extra points.
Out of the fine city of Sydney, an Emu Plains man from out towards Penrith. That's the sporting heartland of the massive Sydney metropolis. But we did see the only punter come off the board in the actual draft being an Australian. We also saw out of the University of Alabama, James Burnett made his way to the New Orleans Saints for a bit of an Aussie on Aussie.
Aussie pipeline.
Little Aussie pipeline. It was Lou Headley, Matt Hayball. Now Burnupp's coming into elite. Well, look, he'll be in there to send a few, and we'll see how that shakes out there. And then out of the University of Auburn, we have Oscar Chapman, who was picked up in undrafted free agency. Again, we just had the one punter drafted, but was picked up, Oscar Chapman, to the Minnesota Vikings out of Auburn. He, another Pro Kick alum, and he carries on. There's a recent tradition because I believe we did have Mr. Berry, who was punting, another Aussie who was punting with the Vikings after a period there with the Steelers as well. So there's a bit of Aussie history in terms of the punting in Minnesota. So look, that's where the Aussies from the special teams are. That was Jordan Berry. I was just running through the multiple Berries that have played college football. On the IPP front, Lucky Tassi has been, there are reports that he was being invited to rookie minicamp with the Detroit Lions. He's one of the IPP candidates from Australia that went through the process locally. 6'7", 347 pounds. I think they were looking line of scrimmage. Obviously, they were looking line of scrimmage early. It's a mixture between offensive line and defensive line. They're looking at it as a defensive tackle right now. Dave Burkett Dave Burkett's actually confirmed that, who's longtime writer for the Free Press there in Detroit, part of the International Player Pathway Program. He's being tagged with that international tag. And another one invited to Seattle Seahawks rookie mini camp. Luke Felix Fulolo, offensive tackle out of the University of Hawaii, was previously at the University of Utah, and has come through the same program, Conquest, that Lake and Bakalaya came through, that Daniel Farlele was originally identified within. So that's a bit of an Aussie update. We'll see as that continues. Obviously, Jordan Pataya signed with the LA Chargers before the draft. And the other Australian, there's a few from this part of the world, but Latimer Sidricki, who's a former National Rugby League player here, played with the North Queensland Cowboys, assigned for a period with the Newcastle Knights as well. Still waiting for any update on him. He's a tight end prospect. That's your little Australian flag emoji to close there, Phil. Did you like that?
I did, Laz. Thank you for the roundup. And we'll be on that all off season, especially with any potential, updates for like Patrick Murtaugh coming off of his ankle injury that abruptly ended his training camp last year. That's going to be on NFL Blitz for the next few weeks. I believe our last episode of the Blitz is the day after the NFL schedule release, reaction to that. Then we have our brief off season during NBA conference finals and NBA finals before we're back. But for anything on the NFL in between, go to NFL.com, ESPN.com.au/NFL or NFL.com if you need, but our stuff is at ESPN.com.au. That man whose internet connection is betraying him is Laurie Horesh. I am Phil Murphy. Thanks so much for hanging out with us on this exactly 1 hour edition of the NFL Brekkie Show. We'll see you next time.